Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Finally, after more than 2 weeks of talking, Theresa May has a deal with the Democratic Unionist Party that will allow her to govern, even though she did not win an outright majority at the election. But the deal comes with a cost. In return for their support in Parliament, the DUP has extracted an extra £1 billion of public spending in Northern Ireland. The deal has been heavily criticised, especially in Wales and Scotland, with both governments arguing they should also receive extra cash. This report from our political editor Laura Koonsberg contains flash photography.
18 days since the election, nearly 3 weeks of waiting. A political lifetime for the Prime Minister.
Deal or no deal, Mrs Foster?
But the DUP, power on their side, have been taking their time. Not just friends, but this a snap of a political family now.
The value of the union.
A deal agreed at the cabinet table, no less.
We also share the desire to ensure that there is a strong government able to put through the programme.
A strong government? Well, less wobbly perhaps. The Northern Irish Party promising their votes in Parliament to prop up Theresa May. That gives her just a majority. This is what they get in return.
Following our discussions, the Conservative Party has recognised the case for higher funding in Northern Ireland, given our unique history and indeed circumstances over recent decades. Today we have reached an outcome that is good for the United Kingdom.
The Tories have promised the DUP an extra £1 billion of taxpayers' cash for Northern Ireland over the next 2 years to spend on infrastructure, health or education projects. And the Tories have had to drop their idea of means testing winter fuel payments for the elderly and making changes to pensions. But in return, the 10 DUP MPs will back the Tories on big votes, like the Queen's speech or the budget.
So I'm used to signing my life away.
Well, I have to say.
The election threw the Tory majority away. As you see on her face, Theresa May would never have chosen this scenario. But they've signed on the dotted line, so they have something to count on, knowing full well other parts of the UK will be angry. And how?
This is cash for votes. It's a bung at the end of the day. In 2 years' time, the DUP will come back and ask for even more money. What's happened here is that the taxpayers of England, Wales and Scotland will continue to suffer austerity, and Northern Ireland won't.
This is not Northern Irish control of Parliament. It's about being able to make Westminster work at all. Ministers knew this criticism would come. Are they prepared?
I'm not against investment in Northern Ireland. I welcome investment in infrastructure and public services, but there ought to be fairness. If there's investment coming to Northern Ireland, Scotland should be getting its fair share.
You're paying £100 million to the DUP for every single one of their votes. You've bought them off, haven't you?
People in all parts of the country are benefiting from the fact that we have a strong enough economy that we can afford to spend more money on health. We've pledged £8 billion on health around the country.
If you're cancelling austerity in Northern Ireland, you're not cancelling it anywhere else. And people in Scotland, Wales, the north of England, haven't they got every right to feel quite cross about this?
Well, people in Scotland, Wales and different parts of England are getting money, but this is separate from that. This is the Northern Ireland Block Grant, which, as I say, has already existed, so this is not unprecedented.
The extra cash might help resurrect joint rule in Northern Ireland, but it just wouldn't have happened if they hadn't agreed to back Theresa May. This small group might not be familiar faces yet, but they're now part of the power behind a shaky throne.
Are we looking at the real government?
Now, in a moment, we can speak to Laura in Westminster. But first, let's go to Belfast and our correspondent Chris Page to talk to him about the implications of the deal for Northern Ireland, especially as negotiations are underway to re-establish the executive at Stormont. So, Chris, how has this gone down with the other parties in Northern Ireland?
Well, the DUP leader, Arlene Foster, went from one negotiation to another. She came straight back from Downing Street and then went into talks here at Stormont with the other parties. Who are trying to strike a deal to restore devolved government here. There's been no power-sharing executive at Stormont since January. And things here for the negotiators were really on hold until people saw what was in the deal between the DUP and the Tories in London. And as so often in Northern Ireland, you really heard two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, an extra £400 million for infrastructure here, £250 million for health, £50 million for education. What politician wouldn't want to go back into government, get their hands on that cash and spend it? On the other hand, could the fact that the DUP and the Tories are now working so closely together at Westminster bring a sense of unease for nationalists? Could nationalists think that, for example, the DUP could basically get favours and be put at an unfair advantage? So plenty of talking still to be done here. The deadline's Thursday. Sinn Féin not wildly enthusiastic about the deal, but not pouring cold water on it either.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. And as I was saying, we can talk to Laura now in Westminster. Laura, so Theresa May has got her deal, but how much stronger is she really politically?
Well, George, it's like she's been flying around in a kind of limbo, experiencing lots of turbulence since the election results that were so disappointing for the Tories. She has now come into land, if you like, but she's still landed on very, very shaky ground. There's concern inside the Conservative Party about the image of this deal being tied to the DUP in this kind of way. There's also real anger from some of the other parties, and in Cardiff, Edinburgh, and probably in the north of England too. If the DUP has managed to get this extra cash for Northern Ireland, what about the rest of the country? But I think it comes down to the brute force of the numbers. Without this deal, Theresa May did not have a majority in the House of Commons. Without this deal, therefore, there was absolutely no guarantee that she'd be able to get anything done. And without this deal, she was very vulnerable to any kind of confidence vote and simply not being able to get her Queen's speech through the Commons later this week. So what this does is give her a layer of political protection. But does this mean she's suddenly massively reinforced and strengthened? Not tonight.
Laura, thank you.
So Theresa May has promised that EU citizens living in Britain will have their rights protected after Brexit. Those who've lived in the country for 5 years before a still-to-be-agreed cut-off date will be granted settled status. But there are still questions about the level of protection on offer. The pledge came after the Prime Minister reached a deal with Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party to sustain her government in power. But she had to promise an extra £1 billion spending in Northern Ireland over the next 2 years to clinch the deal. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Prime Ministers don't come out the front door for all their visitors. This was a carefully choreographed thank you, bigging up the Democratic Unionist Party. Not just brought inside, but sat in front of the cameras at the cabinet table. And then it was on to a grand signing. The DUP whip said it was like signing his marriage certificate 30 years ago.
Last time I signed a significant document on this deal.
30 years, very good, said Theresa May.
So I'm used to signing my life away.
Well, I have to say, 30 years, that's a very good...
But this is a deal for the Parliament that can be reviewed after 2 years and might not survive a change of Tory leader.
We welcome this financial support of £1 billion in the next 2 years, as well as providing new flexibilities on almost £500 million previously committed to Northern Ireland. As a consequence, spending power of almost £1.5 billion will be available to address the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland.
Under the deal, there'll be an extra £1 billion of spending for Northern Ireland, allocated to infrastructure, broadband, the NHS and other services. Northern Ireland had been exempted from the military covenant provisions, like priority housing for military families, but no more. In return for these and other concessions, the DUP promises to support budgets, as well as Brexit and counter-terror legislation.
All of the money that has been outlined is for every section of the community in Northern Ireland. This is a deal that delivers for all of the people of Northern Ireland. We commit to transparency. We are very open to that, and someday I'd like to think we might publish all of the correspondence and conversations we had in 2010 with the Labour front bench, and in 2015 with the Labour front bench, and indeed with the SNP as well.
There's a bit of news.
because some of the faux outrage that we have heard is hypocrisy of the highest order.
I very, very much welcome the support of him and his colleagues on those benches so that we can, as he says, strengthen the union, strengthen the economy in all parts of this country.
The deal proclaims that the two parties have agreed to dump Tory election pledges to drop the pension triple lock and cut winter fuel payments. Labour said the government was going to do that anyway.
It was not the DUP who forced this government to ditch their plans to hit pensioners' incomes. The British people did that on June the 8th. No, this agreement is all about the money. So let me first ask the First Secretary for some clarity on the funding. First, can he explain how much extra funding will be going to support infrastructure, broadband, health, education and tackling deprivation in the rest of the United Kingdom?
What's the price to be paid for keeping this Tory government in power? And remember, Tory government in power is not good for Ireland, north or south.
Theresa May hopes the DUP backing helps her standing in the Brexit talks. This was her leaving the European Council meeting Thursday night, after she'd outlined her proposals for EU citizens living in the UK. Today, the government published more details of that plan.
EU citizens here in the UK, nobody is being asked to leave the United Kingdom. I think this is one of the most important messages we can give to people here, because there has been that anxiety. This is a serious offer, but nobody is being asked to leave the United Kingdom.
The government's document starts by repeating its commitment that there'd be settled status for the 3 million plus EU citizens already in the UK. There could be fingerprinting required for ID cards. There would be no European Court of Justice jurisdiction over the EU citizens, who would lose their automatic right to bring a non-EU partner to Britain.
I believe it is a generous offer. There is one way in which it is different from the offer that the European Union has put, and that is about the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
Brussels believes there are quite a few more differences than just that, and so do the campaign groups representing EU citizens living here, who today met with ministers from the Home Office and the Department for Exiting the EU.
Well, it's definitely not generous. I'm not sure it's questionable that it's fair. It's disappointing. That's not what we had expected.
These rights, whether will they be, when they're negotiated, they're going to be part of the main Brexit deal. Where if this deal doesn't happen at the end, if there's no deal, what happens to us?
Two parties in the Commons are now calling each other right honourable friends.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I could ask the right honourable and even closer friend, the Prime Minister. What reassurance?
They look like they're in the first flush of a political relationship, which the DUP says will give stability to all the UK at a difficult time. Tonight, critics of the deal are queuing up to attack that claim.
Well, obviously you heard one of the strongest critics of the DUP, Sinn Féin, speaking there. There is a little bit of a hope around Whitehall, you pick up, that maybe, incentivised by the idea of distributing some of these goodies around Northern Ireland, maybe Sinn Féin might be more encouraged to come back into power sharing. Stormont might get up and running again. Sinn Féin are saying they have a lot of details still to plough through here. We're definitely not there on any kind of deal in terms of power sharing coming back at the moment. Really angry voices you're hearing from Wales, Scotland, parts of England as well, about how this doesn't appear to be at all fair in terms of distributing scarce resources that the government has. We're also hearing a lot of talk about what people are calling the Quad, that is going to, on an ongoing basis, coordinate this new pact in government. It's the Coordination Committee. Conservatives very keen to say it's not like the Quad in the old coalition, because it'll only be deciding parliamentary business. The DUP are not actually in government. Important to remember, this makes Theresa May a bit stronger with a majority of 13, but not truly strong. And a little earlier I caught up with Damien Green, the First Secretary of State, who was speaking about the new pact in the House of Commons today. And I started by asking him how the terms of the pact seem to say it could be up for review at the end of this session. Was it truly an agreement for the whole of this Parliament?
It's a deal for the whole Parliament. We still have the Fixed Term Parliament Act, so that's 5 years. Indeed, some of the financial support is specifically on a 5-year basis. So we've said that at the end of every parliamentary session we look at the implementation and the way it's being done, but that's not to renegotiate a whole deal. This is a deal designed to give confidence that we will be able to get our legislative programme through, our major pieces of legislation through for the whole Parliament.
Carwyn Jones is saying this is a bung, pure and simple.
Well, he's wrong. What this is an agreement to make sure the government can get its legislative programme through, but at the same time...
You can do a bung to do that.
It's a support
can be an agreement
measure,
with a bung attached.
But the support we've announced is actually considerably less than the support the government made for the Stormont House Agreement in 2014. There have been various times when the parties in Northern Ireland have said we need more support because the devolved institutions need to show that they're successful. There are certain spending demands in Northern Ireland because of the history we all know about, where it's behind the rest of the country, and I hope that this agreement can contribute significantly towards making sure we can get a proper devolved government up and running again in Northern Ireland.
But that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you need their support. You went through an election saying there's no magic money tree. Hey Presto, you seem to have found it.
Well, we found it because we have a strong enough economy that we can afford to increase public spending here.
So this is a 10% increase in their budget. Will the rest of the UK get a 10% increase in budget?
As we have to, I mean, this is specifically targeted increases on things like health and education. At the election, we said there was 8 billion more to spend on the health service, 4 billion more on education. Because we run a successful economy, we can afford to make planned increases in public spending. Just as in previous times in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland's democratic evolution has been helped by support. This is what we hope and expect this to do this time.
Are there implications for other bits of the United Kingdom? Because I'm sure they will be looking at this and thinking, why aren't we getting a 10% hike in budget?
Well, because other bits of the United Kingdom are already benefiting from regionally specific spending. Part of this money is for city deals. There are already £5 billion worth of city deals around England. There are £1 billion worth of city deals, 5 different city deals in Scotland and Wales.
I don't think that's going to wash. You're giving the equivalent of 530 quid per person to the people of Northern Ireland. You're giving nothing equivalent to the people of the rest of the United Kingdom. This isn't going to wash. It's going to look like a straight bung.
Well, only for those who look at it in an incorrect way. People, I'm sure, across the United Kingdom want Northern Ireland to progress down the democratic route, a proper devolved government. That's hugely important. It's been one of the great achievements of the last 15, 20 years or so, and we want to help that continue.
Is this what strong and stable government looks like?
We now have a government that can be confident of getting its legislative programme through, more confident than it would be without this agreement, and people in Northern Ireland can be more confident that their devolved executive can do a good job at bringing prosperity back to them. So I think it's a good deal for the whole country.
Damien Green speaking to Gary Gibbon.
You could call the deal between the Conservatives and Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists political horse trading. At least you could if you were being polite. Political leaders in Scotland and Wales had other, rather stronger words for it. The facts themselves aren't in dispute. The DUP has extracted an extra £1.5 billion of taxpayers' money for Northern Ireland. That's nearly £800 for everyone who lives there. The SNP called it grubby, the First Minister of Wales an outrageous bung. Theresa May didn't actually sign the deal herself. She left that to her chief whip. The thinking goes that it's been designed to keep the Tories in number 10 in general, not Mrs May in particular.
A Prime Minister who needs friends, and these ones from Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party are particularly important because they can decide whether her minority government swims or sinks.
What price for DUP support?
And here is the DUP at the heart of power in the cabinet room. The DUP got the price they wanted, an end to austerity in Northern Ireland.
So I'm used to signing my life away.
Well, I have to say.
And they today signed a pact, a so-called confidence and supply agreement to sustain the Tory party in power for up to 5 years.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament. This agreement will operate to deliver a stable government in the United Kingdom's national interest at this vital time.
So what did the DUP get out of this pact? Well, more than £1.5 billion of spending on schools, health, infrastructure and urban redevelopment, of which £1 billion is completely new money. An abandonment of Tory plans to means test the winter fuel allowance for older people and to end the triple lock on pension rises. Support for Northern Ireland's farmers and ongoing influence on the direction of the government through membership of a newly formed coordination committee.
Why do you need this pact with them?
Well, because it gives people more confidence that the government will be able to make sure its main legislation gets through Parliament.
The deal has been signed by the Chief Whip, not the Prime Minister. Does that mean that it would remain in force were she to stand down?
Yes, but that's not an issue at all.
There are some who will say a tiny number of MPs, 10 DUP MPs, will be wagging the Tory dog.
No, we have said that there's a large number of areas where we overlap with the DUP's ideas. If you look at their manifesto on Brexit, it's very similar to our manifesto on Brexit. The two parties will obviously continue to be separate parties.
So what do they make of this in other parts of Britain?
Well, it's an outrageous bung, frankly, that's been given to the DUP to keep Theresa May in power. It's something that the people of Wales will have to pay for and get no benefit from. It means that austerity will end in Northern Ireland. I don't begrudge them that, but we'll carry on in England, Scotland and Wales.
It's a grubby deal, and I think what this demonstrates is that the government is not dealing with all constituent parts of the UK on a fair and equitable basis. And I expect every Scottish politician to stand up and say the government must make sure there's additional investment in Scotland.
So it's a deal to keep Downing Street occupied by the Tories, but not necessarily her. Robert Heston, News at 10.
The deal with the DUP has focused attention on just how much money does and does not go to Northern Ireland. Are the people there generally hard done by in comparison with the rest of the UK or not? It has always been a political world apart in which the terms Labour, Tory and Lib Dem are rarely heard and have little relevance. But that's not to say Northern Ireland's politics haven't impacted upon the rest of us in all kinds of ways, and this is one more. The Tories were today putting a historical gloss on it. It was all down to the Troubles, they said.
Many times over the years, political parties in Northern Ireland have made a credible case for additional resources because of Northern Ireland's unique circumstances as a society which is recovering from a deep, divisive and bitter episode of the Troubles, lasting over 30 years.
Well, maybe, but the truth is a little more complex. Latest figures show public spending per head in Northern Ireland is already the highest in the UK at nearly £11,000. That's 21% above the UK average. The province spends more than £1,400 per head on education, again above the national average of nearly £1,300. Pupils there perform slightly better too, more than 2/3 pass 5 or more GCSEs at grade A to C. But it does spend a lot more on public order and safety, £688 per person, as compared with £421 in the UK as a whole. So is it, as some have argued, mostly down to the increased security costs in the round?
I think a lot of security expenditure in Northern Ireland has actually been, in the long term, from the UK government, and so it doesn't go through the Barnett formula, which is the mechanism that controls effectively what's available for the Northern Ireland government to spend locally on public services.
We can talk around this subject as much as we all like, but the basic truth is the one we know. The DUP had the Tories over a barrel and they've made them pay for it. Good for them, less good for everyone else. Well, our political editor, Robert Peston, is here with me now to discuss it. Look, Robert, in some ways, I suppose you'd say this is, I mean, in terms of the pact and the alliance itself, some would say it's an alliance of the like-minded and some would say not so much. Stable, do you think? Strong and stable, dare I ask you, but something like it?
The DUP has given a cast-iron commitment in return for that £1.5 billion to vote with the government on budget issues, anything to do with Brexit, any vote, so-called confidence issue that could bring the government down. But there are going to be all sorts of other votes where it will have the opportunity to decide to vote differently from the government if it wishes to. So this does not in any sense guarantee to the Prime Minister that she gets her legislative programme through. Talking to the DUP, they are cock-a-hoop not just about all the money they've got, but also that they'll be sitting on a coordination committee with Tory ministers, shaping the agenda of this government in general. Now, that puts the fear of God into some Liberal Tories because, of course, on issues like gay marriage, many Tories of the DUP are poles apart because the DUP are very small C conservative on those sorts of issues, gay marriage, for example. And you ask how it's going to work. Well, a very recent head of the Treasury said, although they've already got a flipload of money, they will be back for more very soon because, in his words, they have previous. These are very old-fashioned, some would say slightly cynical politicians, and they will take Mrs May for every penny they can.
Okay, well, it's interesting, but perhaps more worrying for people is what's going on back in Northern Ireland. The power-sharing government there is suspended. There's a deadline approaching by which it has to be restored.
Yeah.
How will this impact on that, in your view?
It's not obvious to me that this deal itself will have a big impact, but those talks on forming a Northern Ireland government are at a very tricky juncture. At 4 o'clock on Thursday, if not only the deal's not been done, but we've actually got ministers appointed, for example, in the province, then actually it all collapses and we are back to rule from Westminster. Now, under the arrangements, that cannot go on forever. Under the law, there has to be another election in Northern Ireland within a reasonable period. Nobody actually knows because there's no precedent what a reasonable period means. The government does not want to be forced through the courts to have another election. I'm afraid one of the things that is a risk for people living right now in Northern Ireland, and they're not going to be happy about this. We've had so many elections recently, they may be facing another one before too long.
OK, Robert, thank you. It's complicated. We could say that about politics in every sphere at the moment, but anyway...
Life in every sphere.
We will come back to it.
Now, two major deals were put before the country today, one concerning the UK's relationship with Europe and how Europeans will be allowed to settle here after Brexit. The other, an act of self-preservation for the Conservative government itself. Theresa May signing a £1 billion deal or £100 million for each of the 10 DUP votes needed for her government to reach the majority to secure its position. The Tories will be hoping this down payment to the whole of Northern Ireland will give them a lifeline now and the chance to get the work of the Parliament through. But there has been some deep uneasiness around many of the UK's nations and regions, with some leaders calling it grubby. Our political editor Nick Watt is here. Just talk us through this criticism from the others, Nick.
Well, the criticism really revolves around two key points. Firstly, that this deal has the potential to destabilise the Northern Ireland peace process, and secondly, that point you were saying, that it runs counter to the settlement dating back to the 1970s, known as the Barnett Formula, which is designed to ensure fair funding in the four parts of the UK. So, as you were saying, there have been those complaints from Scotland and indeed from Wales. Now, on the funding, the UK government is saying that the so-called Barnett consequentials, that's the process that ensures that fair funding, that is triggered when extra spending is committed in England. It doesn't happen in reverse. And they also say that there has always been special funding in exceptional circumstances for parts of the UK. So they're saying this process has funded city deals in Scotland, and it's now being used to build up infrastructure and the NHS in Northern Ireland, which obviously the spending fell behind during the Troubles. Now, Sinn Féin has welcomed any extra money for Northern Ireland, but Gerry Adams has made very clear that as far as the peace process is concerned, Sinn Féin will be looking very, very carefully to make sure there's nothing going forward that favours the DUP in dealing with the legacy of those Troubles.
Nick, we also got clarification on the EU citizens deal. At least some of the details came through today.
That's right. Well, Theresa May last week outlined to EU leaders what she called a generous offer for the 3 million EU citizens living in the UK, in the hope of guaranteeing the 1 million UK citizens who live in the rest of the EU. So what we learned today is that those 3 million EU citizens living here will be eligible for settled status, which will allow them to enjoy similar rights that they have now. So if they've been in the country for 5 years and as yet unspecified cut-off point, then they could apply for that status, not being here for 5 years, then can go on a path to get that status. And that will mean having a form of an identity card. Quite ironic for David Davis, the Brexit secretary, who campaigned against those a year ago. But these will be sort of virtual ID cards with a sort of a data stored in a Home Office computer. But Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, he's not happy, says it doesn't go far enough, more ambition, and he says that you've got to guarantee the rights of EU citizens under EU law. What that means is projection and oversight by the European Court of Justice. That is a step too far for the UK.
Nick, thanks very much. We tried to work out a little bit what that settled status meant and what date it would start from. And earlier I spoke to Brandon Lewis. He's the Immigration Minister who previously served as both Housing Minister and Fire Services Minister as well. I began by asking him what the settled status would entail.
Well, once somebody registers for settled status and gets that, it will be lifelong. In terms of how they go about that, we're going to bring forward an outline of exactly what that process will be next year. It will be very light touch, probably using digital technology as much as we can. We want to get and have a very simple system for people so they can move through it easily, not get caught up in, tons and tons of documents. We want to make it very light touch, very simple, very quick for people.
When you say tons and tons of documents, is that you ruling out an ID card system, just for clarity?
It's me ruling out an 85-page document for people to have to fill in. We want this to be easy, simple, light touch.
But it could be an ID card, is that right?
I'm not saying it could be, I'm saying it will not be an 85-page document.
If there are dependents, for example, French parents living in London, I think you've heard this example before, with a daughter studying in Paris, will she be able to join her parents? How much will this extend to family members outside the UK whose parents or whose...
Well, that depends on when they're applying for settled status. If they've been here for 5 years, the family have been here for 5 years, they could apply for that settled status, and they would have that for life. If they have not been here 5 years, they'll have an opportunity to stay here to get to 5 years to have that. Obviously, after that, they then have broadly the same rights as a UK citizen. But if somebody then does go abroad and wishes to come back, that would have to be looked at in light of the immigration rules at that point in time.
Just talk to me a little bit about your position now on immigration, because we haven't heard much since the manifesto. Are you sticking with the tens of thousands? Is that still the aim, the objective?
Well, in terms of net migration, yes, we want to have a level of sustainable net migration. We're going to be talking to sectors from business, agriculture, the universities, which I'll be doing as well as my colleagues across government, to make sure we have a system that welcomes the brightest and the best. We obviously want people who are here to stay here. That's very much what the Prime Minister was outlining today, to contribute to our society and our economy.
Because we've heard successive Conservative government after government talk about trying to hit tens of thousands. I'm just trying to work out, are you still aiming to get that number under tens of thousands, or has that gone now?
What we said in the manifesto, and we've said consistently for some time, is we want a sustainable level. That is our aspiration, it's the aim, it's what we want to work towards. We're very clear with the British people. We want to get it down to sustainable levels, which we do believe is tens of thousands, but we can't put a timescale on it because we haven't yet left the European Union. So it's when we leave the European Union, we get full control of our borders, and in the meantime, that work with universities, with businesses, sectors across the country and across government, make sure we have a system that works for everyone.
Minister, just while we have you here, you were, of course, the Housing Minister and the Fire Minister as well. As we reflect on the lessons to be learnt from the Grenfell fire, as Housing Minister in 2014, you said that building developers should not be forced to fit sprinklers. Your department declined to bring in regulation that would force them to fit sprinklers. Why?
Well, actually, that's not correct. First of all, I wasn't the Housing Minister at the time of that speech, and I'm not an expert on building regulations because I was never the Minister responsible for building regulations. That speech was when I was the Fire Minister, and that speech was actually a speech that I made in favour of sprinklers, and I actually was outlining the importance and the benefits that sprinklers can bring. What I was actually saying was that there are a whole range of fire safety measures out there. There's a whole range of different types of fire sprinkler systems out there. It's not for the government to choose a particular system. It's up to building owners, whether it is a social housing owner in a high-risk building or in a commercial high-risk building or a high-rise or a low-density building, to look at what is appropriate, because they have a duty of care to people in their buildings.
Did you not say the cost of fitting a fire sprinkler system may affect house building, which is something we want to encourage, so we must wait to see what impact?
Well, yeah, exactly. And what I was saying was, obviously, we want to make sure we're building more houses. New build homes, of course, actually have been increasing over that period of time and have more increasing levels of fire safety. Indeed, we brought in the requirement to have smoke detectors, for example, for private landlords.
Is it not conceivable that some of those decisions which came under your departments, either in fire or housing, could have been taken very differently? Do you not have regrets about the kind of decisions that were taken then?
I think any of us who have been involved in politics from when these buildings were built in the 1960s, the 1970s through to today will be looking at what went wrong at Grenfell, what can we do to make sure this never happens again.
You spoke about regulation. You said in our commitment to be the first government to reduce regulation, we've introduced the one-in, two-out rule for regulation. Your culture then was about cutting red tape, and that was the kind of red tape we now see could have saved lives.
But it's a matter of looking at regulation right across government, not just around these issues. We'll all be wanting to learn the lessons from what happened at Grenfell to make sure this can never happen again. This shouldn't have been able to happen. We don't know exactly why it happened yet. We've got to get to the bottom of that.
Brandon Lewis, thank you.